Hi, everyone, and welcome to week two of World Civilization since 1500. So today I'm going to do two PowerPoints for you guys, and I'm going to put them in separate videos. The first one is going to actually go back before 1500 and kind of set the stage for what we're going to be learning about some of the empires that you need to study this week. But I'm going to talk about the origins of Islam, who Muhammad was, when it was founded, things like that, just so you have a good footing on that particular part of the information. So I've titled this Islam and the Early Arab Conquest. I'm going to minimize myself and we'll get going here. Okay, so why study Islam? Well, about 1/4 of the global population today follows the religion of Islam or has grown up in the Islamic tradition. So, this particular map comes from PBS and it's actually interactive. If you Google PBS World Religions, excuse me, you can actually click on each of these and it will give you percentages and all kinds of interesting statistical data about these religions and these places. But you can see here, Islam is in the green, so it's kind of centralized in this region here. So we want to look at a timeline of Abrahamic religions. Going back to 1400 BC, you've got the Torah, which established the Jewish religion. The Torah is the first five books of the Bible. And so Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So then Israel sort of enters recorded history. They have the time of the kings where they adopt a lot of other religions. And Isaiah writes, I am the first and the last. Besides me, there is no God. So this is just to point out that they are a monotheistic society in a sense. That's how originally in the Torah it was set up to be monotheistic. Some scholars would argue that they became polytheistic when they started worshiping, the gods of the Philistines and things like that. And then you get into somewhere around 3, 4 BC. We're not 100% sure is when Christ was born. A lot of people think it was zero. There actually is no zero, so that's a little misconception about the timeline. So it's somewhere, I don't know, 3, 4, somewhere around there. And then 610 AD is when you actually have the beginning of Islam. So it was much later. Judaism is much older. However, we talk about three religions that are based on Abraham and the Abrahamic faith. Well, that would be Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Okay, so if you look here, this is the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia. And so you've got Mecca is here, and then Yemen, Oman, United Arab Emirates, things like that. Now, at the time that Muhammad lived, the Arabian Peninsula was very loosely united as nomadic tribes. They weren't really one unified people. Although they were unified in some ways. You also have, this is a bigger picture, so you have the Arabian Peninsula here, what I just showed you on the previous map. You also have the Persian Empire here in Iran, and then you have the Byzantine Christian Empire, which is sort of a revived Roman Empire here with Constantinople being the capital there. Okay, so um, Philip Hittite was a Lebanese American professor and scholar from Princeton and Harvard. He wrote a book in the 1970s called A History of the Arabs. And he states, as the probable cradle of the Semitic family, the Arabian Peninsula nursed these people who later migrated into the Fertile Crescent and later became the Babylonians, Assyrians, Phoenicians, and the Hebrews of history. As the plausible fount of pure Semitism, the sandy soil of the peninsula is a place wherein the rudimentary elements of Judaism and consequently Christianity, together with the origin of these traits, which later developed into a well delineated Semitic character, should be fought for. So that's a really fancy way to say, okay, what is a Semite? First of all, it deals with the region that they're from. It also is tied up into the language. And he's saying that all of these religions sort of flowed out of that area. So, what is a Semite? Well, I like to refer to Webster's 1828 dictionary when I'm looking up information, and I'll sort of compare it to the modern Webster's just to see the difference. Webster's 1828 is online, so you can Google it if you're interested in that. They call it Shemitic, an adjective pertaining to Shem, the son of Noah. The Shemitic languages are Chaldee, Syriac, Arabic, Hebrew, Samaria, Ethiopic, and Old Phoenician. So you can kind of see on this map all the brown areas are where these Semitic places are located. Um, Modern Webster's calls it Semitic rather than Shemitic. And if you understand anything about Hebrew, you know that they have a letter called the Shin, and it's got a little dot above the top, right? And so if you put the dot on the right side, it makes an SH sound. If you put the dot on the left side, it makes an S sound. And so that's why there's this little difference there. It's all about, remember, it says somewhere that no jot or tittle will be changed. Well, that's what this is talking about. You also have this interesting little dot called the dagesh that does a lot of interesting things in Hebrew. So anyway, that's why you have that. But a Semite is a member of any of a number of people of the ancient southwestern Asians, including the Akkadians, Phoenicians, Hebrews, and Arabs. So it kind of brings a new meaning to the term anti-Semitism when you put it in a broad light like that. So I encourage you to look up the differences there. Here's a bigger map if you kind of want to pause and take a look at this just to see where these places are located. This is a map from, I want to say, the late 1800s of what Saudi Arabia looked like. And so you've got, you can kind of see all these loosely organized tribes who lived here. They all considered themselves sort of part of the same family in a way, but also very distinct. Almost like the Greek city-states, but not so organized, definitely more nomadic. Um, so the identity of Arabs before Islam. This is really important. In the Old Testament era, the Jews were geographically next door neighbors of the Arabs, and racially they were the nearest of kin. Hebrew and Arabic are cognate Semitic tongues. Some Hebrew names in the Old Testament are Arabic, such as those given to Esau's sons. A South Arabian would have but little difficulty understanding the first 5 verses of the book of Genesis in Hebrew. Moses married an Arabic woman from Midian who also worshipped the same God known as Yahweh, but he's referenced as Yahoo. And so that's very important to understand the connection. So Philip Hittite says etymologically, Arab is a Semite word meaning desert inhabitant with no reference to nationality. In a sense, the Hebrew word Arab is used in Isaiah 21:13, 13:20, Jeremiah 3:2. In the Quran, Arab is used for Bedouins, which is sort of nomadic people. You also have Second Maccabees, which is only in the Catholic Bible, as far as I know, and it makes Arabs and nomads synonymous. The first certain instance of the biblical use of the word as a proper name occurs in Jeremiah 25:24, the kings of Arabia. The kings were referred to were, in all probability, sheiks of northern Arabia and the Syrian desert. By the 3rd century BC, the term was beginning to be used for any inhabitant of the peninsula. So let me just stop here and just make a comment. If you want to use any of this information in your paper, in your reading and study response this week, please you can reference the PowerPoint, and there's a way to cite that in APA. So maybe look up on your chat GPT how to cite a PowerPoint. And you can put my name on it and the college name. But what I really encourage you to do is the things that I've got here that are in quotations, they came from this book. You know, I'm pretty good about telling you where I got my information. And so I would encourage you to cite this book here rather than the PowerPoint, because that's really the origin of the information. Okay, so then there's another book. It's called Imagining the Arabs by Peter Webb. This is a newer book. Remember the one I just referred to was written in the 1970s. This was written in the 2000s. So Peter Webb says that all Arabs from the 7th century do not fit neatly into one category, that pre-Islamic Arabians were robbed of their history because they are thought of as nomadic tribes that did not unite until the creation of Islam. So, recovering Arab history is hampered by the tendency to label pre-Islamic Arabians and early Muslim Middle Eastern communities as, quote, Arab. This approach treated them like a block of humanity. And so these are two opposing views in history. I want you to recognize that. You've got Hittite's view. Remember, he's a scholar from Princeton and Harvard from the 1970s. And Also, you've got Peter Webb here with a newer view that has a newer argument. So just kind of recognize that these two things don't really synthesize well. I'm not here to teach you that one is right and one is wrong. I encourage you to do your own research, maybe get both of these books and read them and see what you think is the correct way to interpret that. So let's go back to Assyrian records. So one of the things that Webb does is he looks at these Assyrian records, pre-Islamic Arabian populations in Assyria, and he states that the Hebrew Bible references Arab. So that's that's the Hebrew word Arab. It's Arab, and I'm going to go into that in just a minute. So Arab cognates to describe either a way of life practiced outside of Israel or a group living outside the boundaries of the Israelite lands. So Hebrew and South Arabian employment of Arab cognates thus mirror the earlier Semitic language and Assyrian connotations. This unfurls a long history of the word Arab, connotating the idea of outsiderness, redolent of foreign nomadism, and neither indicative of nor translatable as one of the Arab people. Okay, so outsiders is the word used as Arab for convenience sake and not because pre-Islamic Arabian populations were culturally cohesive and conscious of their overarching Arab identity. Okay, so this is Webb's argument here. Arab and the Hebrew language. So I can read Hebrew for the most part, and so I've kind of taken this apart for you guys. Notably, each one of these Old Testament passages has the same root word. And it's probably, rather than to go through and explain all this in words, I'm just going to show you what I mean. The word Arab looks like this. Now notice your root word. So you've got the ayin, the resh, and the veit. Okay, and these little dots and lines are vowels. So these are consonants, these are vowels. So notice the word for evening is the same, except it has different vowels, Erev. So you've got Arev, Erev, and Arav is crossover. And what's really interesting is a Hebrew person, Ivrit, is a person who has crossed over. So there's definitely sort of a connotation in Hebrew that all of these words have some sort of connection, right? And if you go back to the Paleo, so just about every language has a Paleo script, which means that these were actually symbols in the original language that changed when Israel was exiled to Babylon. But this is super interesting because you can kind of see even further connections in the symbolism, which I don't have time to go into all that here, but it's very fascinating. Okay, so family connection, right? Many scholars argue that these two groups were originally derived from the same family through the lineage of Ishmael and Isaac, which you may have heard of, maybe not, I'm not sure. But we've got another book here called The Dome of the Rock, and historian Jerry M. Landay states that blood ties to the social unit, the tribe, assured the Bedouin of only one thing: collective strength in the unending struggle for pasture, water, and material sustenance. Landay goes on to say that the Arab precisely fitted the description of his legendary biblical ancestor Ishmael. This created historic bonds that undoubtedly created bonds through shared heritage and culture. So it's very possible. Okay, so that brings us to Muhammad. Muhammad was born into the Quraysh tribe, which ruled Mecca at the time. Remember, this is somewhere around the late 500s. They controlled the religion in Arabia, so they were probably the most powerful tribe at that time. And in addition to being born into the most powerful tribe, he was born into one of the most powerful families in this tribe. Both of his parents died by the time he was 6 years old, so he was raised by his uncle, who was a tribal sheik. Muhammad spent much of his youth tending to sheep and cattle, but he also enjoyed working with caravans of traders who passed through the city. Now, Arabia was polytheistic, right? So they worshiped many gods. At the time that Muhammad was born, a black square temple was erected in the city of Mecca. Remember, I showed you where Mecca was on the map. If you want to go back and look at that, you can. So this black square is called Kaaba, the Kaaba. And this is where about 360 gods were worshipped. So, as seen in many cultures, the Arabs left offerings and goods at the Kaaba to seek favor with the gods. Worshippers would march around the temple worshiping and praying. And the most devoted worshippers would kiss a black stone that was embedded in the wall of the Kaaba. Supposedly, the stone was once white, and some scholars have labeled it to be a meteorite, but no one's ever been allowed to analyze it, so we're not really sure exactly what material it's made of. But Muslims believe that the black stone fell from heaven at the same time that Adam and Eve were removed from the Garden of Eden. Note that the Muslims and Christians adhere to the same creation story. So, in my course that I teach on World Civilization to 1500, we look at creation stories and kind of compare and contrast the similarities to the story in the Bible. There are many running trends, and also with the flood stories as well. There are over 200 flood stories. So all of that kind of connects. But Abraham and Ishmael built the first place of prayer in Mecca, which is what makes it a very important place. Eventually, Muhammad placed the stone back in its place in the 7th century. So today, what this is a picture of over here, this is a little viewfinder. So this is not the actual stone. It's a little bit, the picture can be a little bit misleading because we're not there. But you can look through the glass and see the stone. And I believe some people are allowed to go inside and actually touch it, which is very special. So, when Muhammad was about 20 years old, he accepted a job helping a widow named Khadijah with her estate. And now she was about 15 years older than him, but they ended up getting married. They were very happy. They had 3 children of their own and adopted a son after their twin boys passed away. So, when Muhammad was 40 years old, he claimed to be receiving revelations from the angel Gabriel. And he was told that there was only one God, Allah. So, you have a polytheistic society, remember, now potentially becoming monotheistic if his religion takes off, which we know that it did. So, that's a huge shift for a society, right? So, note that Allah Ta'ala was one of the gods who was worshipped at the Kaaba. And so, they think that he pulled this name from there. And so Muhammad received more revelations over the coming years, but he was unable to record them because he couldn't read or write. And so he said he was said to have memorized them by repeating them back to Gabriel. And so this is the mountain where he claimed to receive his revelations, Jabal al-Nur, which means the mountain of light. And this is the cave Hira, which is marked. Supposedly, this is the cave where he was at on that mountain. Okay, so let's talk about some other sources. Theophanes, or Theophanes, one of the first Byzantine chroniclers to offer an account of the Arab conquest was Theophanes the Confessor. He was born around AD 759 in Constantinople, and he was a descendant of Emperor Leo the Isaurian. One of his essential works, Chronographia, offers a historical account of the Byzantine Empire and surrounding nations from roughly AD 285 to 813. In this account, he offers a unique examination of the Islamic prophet Muhammad. Theophanes stated factual information about the prophet's upbringing that is widely accepted. And he also informs readers that Muhammad struggled with a disease that almost sounds like epilepsy. He hoped to discredit the Islamic faith, as many Christians did, and so he argued that the visions Muhammad had were actually attempts to hide this condition. And so, one of the important things that historians do as they conduct research, because remember, we're not just looking up information on the internet to answer our questions, we're really digging deep into what do the primary sources say. And this is one of the very essential primary sources. And one of the things you'll notice as I go through my PowerPoints is I try to lean on the works of scholars. So people like Peter Webb and Philip Hitti, who I mentioned earlier, these are scholars who have read the primary sources themselves. Typically, scholars can read other languages, so they can kind of decipher some of that kind of thing. And so we really want to lean on good source information. Make sure you try to avoid, I call it the shotgun approach, where you just type in something in your search bar and you start looking up information, but you have no idea about the author who you're reading. You want to make sure that your author is a scholar. And so that's why we're referencing some of these works like this. We're looking at primary sources. So it was not until after Muhammad's death that the Holy Book of Islam was written. Muhammad only shared his revelations with his immediate family at first, and so they were his first converts. That was his wife, his cousin Ali, his servant Zaid, and also Abu Bakr. So Bakr convinced 5 of his friends to convert to the teachings of Muhammad, and these 6 men became known as Muhammad's companions who worked to establish the Islamic faith. So we get most of the information about Muhammad's life from what's known as the Hadith, and there are multiple of these. Some are known to be more reliable than others, but I bring that up in case you do want to look at where this information came from. A lot of these are available online. So the reliability of Arab sources. Joseph Earl, who wrote from a classical atlas to illustrate ancient geography, which is where I got my primary source map I showed you earlier. Excuse me. The descendants of Ishmael, he says, the present occupiers of this country, so jealously guard and prevent the access of any foreigners to its interior that we are obliged to fill up the want of direct knowledge with supposition. With its coastline, we are well acquainted, but of the interior, with the exception of a few portions, we know nothing except the information which is derived from doubtful authority. So, they were a pretty closed country for a long time, and it was very hard to get information. Very few records, written records, exist, and so historians have sort of had to piece together a lot of Arab history because it's just a little unclear. Um, but you have other converts. The merchants and leaders in Mecca were not as easy to convince as Muhammad's family members. They felt that a monotheistic religion would threaten their business because visitors bought sacrifices from numerous gods. And so you can kind of see where this would be a problem. And this is going to change the entire social structure of society. And so Muhammad and his followers became unwelcome in Mecca. However, more and more people began to follow him, which made the Arabian leaders nervous, and they offered to pay physicians to heal him of his condition. So eventually, the followers of Muhammad experienced torture through harsh conditions like exposure to the sun. Now, these are some of the little gods that were sold in Mecca, in case you're interested in that. So many Muhammad's followers left their clans and tribes. Around that time, Muhammad's wife and a good friend died. So Muhammad moved to a nearby village, but they tried to stone him and cast him out. And it was during this time that he received more messages from the angel Gabriel. He was supposedly transported on a winged horse to Jerusalem, where he stood at the Wailing Wall. And this is one of the reasons why he considered Jerusalem to be a holy site. Now, he found refuge in Medina, where many Jews lived, and the merchants of Medina liked him, and the Jews found him to be a decent man at that time. So eventually, the leaders in Mecca tried to assassinate him, but he escaped to the south with his friend Abu Bakr, and they hid in a cave. Now, as legend goes, the enemies were looking for him, and they came to the cave where he was, but they found a spider web, this giant spider web in the entrance, and they assumed that no one had gone in because they would have knocked the web down. And so today, the spider is a sacred symbol in Islam because of that story. So the Hijra. In 622, Muhammad made a trip from Mecca to Medina that has been named the Hijra. He was welcomed like a visitor, and at this point, Islam was coming to life. He was on his way to becoming a powerful leader, and he married several women. He didn't, however, many people did not want to convert to Islam, so he still had a lot of opposition at that point. He began rewarding his followers with promises of paradise if they fought for him, which is sort of where that originated. And that leads us to the first jihad. Now, that's a holy war. Eventually, Muhammad built a trench around Medina to protect himself and his followers, and this led to a 10-year peace treaty. Muhammad broke the agreement after only 2 years, and so this was in 630, and this became known as the First Jihad. Now, he marched into Mecca and overtook the city. There was not much of a fight because he had so many followers. And after this, Muhammad declared at the Kaaba that there was only one God, Allah, and he forbade the worship of other gods. So he allowed the tradition of kissing the black stone to continue. And this was also when he implemented the requirement to face Mecca when praying. And so you can kind of see his trek here. So, how did this impact the Jews? Because remember, at this point, the Jews have been dispersed. In 70 AD is when Rome came in and overtook Israel. And the Jews didn't return to Israel until 1948. So they sort of wandered around, and we call this the second diaspora, right? So the Jews are wandering around, and they settle in the Holy Roman Empire, which is Germany. They settled in Spain. Um, they settled in the area that we know today as Russia, and they settled in the Middle East in Saudi Arabia and places like that. So you have Jews living, displaced Jews are living in these regions. And so the Jews they kind of felt like this was blasphemous for several reasons. Muhammad proclaimed at one point to be their awaited Messiah. You can understand why that might have upset them. Eventually, the Jews were told to convert or die. And so at least 600 Jews were killed by Muhammad and his army, and some Jewish women and children were taken captive as slaves. By the end of his life, Muhammad became more militant. He was known for executions and military raids. Muhammad died in AD 632 at the age of 62, and by the time he died, nearly all of the Arabian Peninsula was Islamic. Now, let me back up for just a minute about the Jewish portion, and I think I say this on a later slide, but I'm going to add it here just to clarify. It didn't start out well, but eventually the Jews actually allied with the Islamic Caliphate because they were persecuted by the Christians, and the Islamic group actually offered them more freedom at some points in history than the Christians did. But I'll get into that in just a minute. Okay, so the Battle of the Levant. So this began in AD 629 when 3,000 Bedouins on camels from Medina attacked the southern tip of the Dead Sea. Now, there's a historian from around 1776, same year that the Declaration of Independence was written. His name is Edward Gibbon, and he stated that the first military action which tried the valor of Muslims against a foreign enemy was the Levant. So, in the narrow valley of Yarmouk in northern Palestine, they virtually annihilated a crack in the Byzantine army of 25,000 men. And that was from the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. So you can see this is where the Levant is located. This gives you a clear picture of Cyprus. The island of Cyprus is included here. And so you've got Israel. This is Jordan. Yeah, this is so Judea and Samaria biblically is the West Bank right here. So that's kind of interesting. So they overtook all of that. And at the time, remember the map I showed you at the beginning, this was the land belonging to the Byzantine Empire and some of it in Persia as well. Oh, here you go. I'll put it on here again. Forgot it was here. So yeah, so you can kind of see Byzantine here, Persian here, Levant here. Okay. So let's talk about the Persians for just a minute. So you've got this Greek thinker, Zarathustra. Um, so Zoroastrianism is a religion that probably began somewhere around 1500 BC, and it's possibly connected to Cyrus the Great, who is actually mentioned in the Bible and many extra biblical sources as well. So Zoroastrianism is monotheistic, but some scholars will call it dualistic. I really go into religions in my other class. I'm not going to have a lot of time to dig into that with you guys. But the god is Ahura Mazda, and it also has themes of good versus evil. Taoism is also dualistic, and it's represented by the yin and the yang, while Zoroastrianism describes opposing forces as more combative and warlike. The three wise men who visited baby Jesus in the Bible were probably Zoroastrian priests. The word magic comes from the word magi. And so, because the wise men were essentially magicians, that's kind of how we, progress to that ideology. So, biblical scholars think that they may have known what sort of star patterns to look for because of Daniel. There's a book in the Bible called Daniel. It talks about prophet who lived in Babylon, and he probably told them a lot about Hebrew understanding of the stars and the constellations and things like that. The Hebrew calendar was based on lunar cycles, and so he probably told them all those things. And we think that that's how they knew what to look for. And so the Persian invasion of Jerusalem. Okay, so now we're getting into a little bit of this week's content, but I'm going to get deeper into it in part 2 of this video series. So, leading up to this, the Sassanid Persians butchered between 60,000 and 90,000 Christians in Jerusalem and sold a vast number of them into slavery. Theophanes stated that the Jews had negative reaction to the teachings of Muhammad. This idea was presented to support his position on Islam. So, according to Theophanes, that even the Jews, whom the Christians took issue with, saw the problems of Islam. However, he also records the Jewish murder of Christians in record numbers. Um, he states that in the year 614, the Persians took Jordan, Palestine, and the Holy City by force. They slew as many as 90,000 people. We're not really sure because you have all these varying accounts that have different numbers in them. So somewhere 60,000, 90,000, something like that. But the idea is that really the Jews wanted the Holy Land back, right? I mean, and so the Persians had it. If you look at that map, the Persians conquered the Byzantines. They took back the Holy Land for a time, and they gave the Jews a sector of it for about 5 years. They were able to take that. And so it did give them kind of what they wanted. Now, you have this other account, Antiochus Strategios. This account is mostly corroborated. He was a monk living in Palestine during the 7th century. He despised the Jews, and he stated, thereupon the vile Jews, the enemies of the truth and haters of Christ, when they perceived that the Christians were given over to the hands of the enemy, rejoiced exceedingly because they detested the Christians. His account relies on the word of a man named Thomas, who was an eyewitness, and Thomas numbered the slaughter of Christians at 66,509. So, again, different numbers there. But the idea is sort of the same. And a lot of this problem really stemmed from an emperor of the Byzantine Empire called Heraclius. Heraclius tried to force the Jews to convert to Christianity, which really upset them. And so I think all of this information with Islam and with the Byzantines and with the Persians, the conclusion that you can draw from this is that there really has to be some sort of separation of church and state. People don't like being forced to believe any ideology. And, freedom of religion is essentially the freedom to think for yourself. And it's very important that we maintain that if we're going to live peacefully. And you will notice historically that civilizations that have succeeded and done well typically have freedom of religion because it abates a lot of problems and a lot of bloodshed and warfare in the end. So Eutychius of Alexandria, or I'm sorry, I believe it's Eutychius. Some of these Greek words I'm a little bit off with. He was known as Sayyid ibn Batrik. He offers further information about Jewish, Arab, and Christian relations. So he was born somewhere around 877. So this is a couple hundred years after the event. He was from Cairo in Egypt, and he became a patriarch around AD 933. So he wrote a history of the world, which he titled The String of Pearls. Now, Eutychius, let me say it correctly, Eutychius stated that there were 4,000 Jews at Tyre who organized a massacre of Christians by writing to the Jews in Jerusalem, Cyprus, and Damascus, the hill country of Galilee, and Tiberias. And they hoped that all the Jews would band together on the night of Christian Passover in order to slay the Christians in Tyre. So after this, they would journey to Jerusalem for the same purpose. So this is some pretty nefarious stuff. However, the governor of Tyre received intel of this conspiracy and he closed the city and he arrested the Jews. So on the night of the Passover, Eutychius records that about 26,000 Jews surrounded the city, but the people of Tyre were able to overcome them. So some Jews were beheaded to create examples of what would happen to traitors, which caused many Jews to flee. And Eutychius goes on to explain that the plan for Jerusalem was carried out, and the Jews slaughtered more Christians than Persians. The people asked for the Jews to be slain, but Heraclius said that he had sealed a written covenant to grant them security. So, going back to the Dome of the Rock, the book that I referenced earlier, the Temple Mount became important to the Arabs during the 7th century because of the famous tale of the Prophet Muhammad's night journey to Jerusalem, in which he began his phantasmagoric ascent to heaven from atop of the scarred and pitted rock. So here you have a mosaic depicting the Arabs. Byzantine Emperor Heraclius reigned from 610 to 641. So I kind of mentioned him briefly a moment ago. Sometimes his name is spelled with a K instead of a C, Heraclius. But he was the fifth emperor after Justinian and Theodora. So you can look up, there's a great documentary I can share with you if you're interested on the Byzantine Empire. That's not really what we're covering in this class because this is from 1500, not to 1500. But you do kind of need all this to set the stage. But anyway, so you have Emperor Heraclius. He was fifth emperor after Justinian and Theodora of the Byzantine Empire, Augustus of Imperial Rome, and he eventually began to gain ground around 640. It was during this time that a group of envoys appeared and admonished him to acknowledge Muhammad as the living apostle of the Lord. Now, he had no idea who Muhammad was. Muhammad had not yet made a name for himself at that time, so he kind of brushed it off like no big deal and continued to gain ground. Eventually was hailed as savior as the Christian civilization in the Byzantine Empire. So only 4 months after he triumphantly entered Jerusalem and he was able to overtake from the Persians, Mecca submitted to Muhammad, and then he kind of was like, oh, maybe this guy is someone to watch, right? He's pretty significant. So Caliph Omar ibn al-Khatib was left with special instructions by Muhammad about the holy city, the temple that was burned down by Emperor Titus in Jerusalem. And so by the time that Omar entered the city, it was being used as a rubbish dump. So not a great place, right? And Omar planned to return to the site to its former splendor for the glory of Allah. And so he fought with all his might, but a man named Sophronius held the line in Jerusalem. So eventually, Sophronius was overpowered, and Omar requested his official surrender. And so you have Theophanes here with his chronicle. According to him, Omar also requested that Sophronius begin removing waste from the Temple Mount with his bare hands. Omar said, by him whose hands is my soul, this is the place described to us by the Apostle Allah. Let us make this place for a mosque. And in response, Sophronius, according to Theophanes, said, verily, this is the abomination of the desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel, and it now stands in the holy place. So I encourage you to read Theophanes and get that primary source information for yourself if you're interested in learning more about that. Um, Arab victories. So in the 660s, the desert tribes who emerged from the Arabian Peninsula experienced such great victory that Emperor Constans II left Constantinople to find refuge in Sicily. Now, unlike the emperor, many senators refused to leave the Byzantine capital because of their confidence in the power of the empire. So eventually, they saw a victory over the Arabs in 678. But nonetheless, this turbulent period transformed the ancient Roman world, and the establishment at Damascus of an Islamic caliphate created a permanent rival to the Byzantine Empire. So, what you see on this map here, which I believe I've got bigger, yeah, on the next slide, is you can see the dark green is what was under Muhammad originally. Somewhere around 634, you have Abu Bakr. And then as it gets lighter in green color, that's about, it shows the progression of how they expanded until they got into Spain. And eventually, you have what's known as Al-Andalus in Spain and the Golden Age of Spain. And this is where the Jews were really helpful along the way here in North Africa and things like that, and helping them gain entrance into some of these cities and helping, to guard the men in the cities when they went on to conquer further to the west. So, why did Islam spread so quickly? Well, scholars have several ideas. Perhaps because prior to the creation of Islam, the people of the Arabian Peninsula were nomadic tribes that were loosely united. After Islam, the nomadic tribes united in an unprecedented way that gave them strength. Muhammad also gave them energy through religious zeal. They were able to take advantage of the situation between the Byzantines and the Persians and capitalize on it. And Christianity was still very young at that time in the Roman Empire, so it was not very well established. So that leads us to the Dome of the Rock. So Omar eventually built a ramshackle mosque. Bishop Archifocus, I'm sorry, I'm so bad with some of these names. Archifos a Christian pilgrim who visited Jerusalem around 670 said that in a renowned place where once the temple had been magnificently constructed, the Saracens now frequent a four-sided house of prayer, which they built rudely, constructing it by raising boards and great beams on some remains of the ruins. This house it is said, hold 3,000 men at once. So that's not the Dome of the Rock, right? That was a construction before the Dome of the Rock that wasn't nearly as elaborate as what we see here in this photo. The Mosque of Omar ratified the claim of the third great religion of the Holy City. Abd al-Malik Ibn Marwan replaced Omar's building with the Dome of the Rock. Construction began in 687, that's AD, and was completed around 692. So a Byzantine citizen named John Tzitzis once said about the Byzantine Empire, one finds me as Scythians, Latin among Latins. To the Persians, I speak in Persians. To the Arabs, since they are Arabs, I address in Arabic. To the Jews, I say in proper manner in Hebrew, you blind house devoted to magic. Your mouth a chasm engulfing flies. You stony Jew, the Lord has come, lighting be upon your head. This was written to demonstrate what it was like to welcome visitors to the Byzantine capital. All were greeted well except Jews who received insults. So the idea that Jews were treated poorly has gone on for a very long time. This man who wrote this was a scholar of languages. And so what he's saying here is that he'll greet everyone in the language in which they speak originally, except for the Jews. He'll greet them in their Hebrew, but he'll kind of greet them with an insult rather than a welcome. And so, like I said, this is just something the Jews, why are the Jews treated like this? You know, what is the deal? Well, Jews were different, right? Jews refused to conform. They wanted to keep their Jewish tradition, and sometimes their Jewish traditions looked a little odd compared to what the cultural norm was in the city where they lived. And so they typically weren't very politically active, and especially in places where you were forced to convert, like and in the Byzantine Empire, you know, you had Heraclius, but even before that, Justinian and Theodora wanted to create this unified Christian society, and the Jews refused to conform, and that just created some problems within. And so that's one of the reasons that you see that, not the only reason, but you know, you could go into a deep dive with some of that. Historian Henry Abramson is a Jewish historian. He works for Landers College. He says that over the past 200 years, that the relationship has been fractured and difficult. It's occurred because of nationalist movements, because of Zionism. And Zionism is the idea that the Jews should repopulate the homeland. This started under Theodor Herzl in the late 1800s. But in a broader historical viewpoint, Jews fared better under Muslim control than Christian control, according to Henry Abramson. And a lot of other scholars as well will say that. Islam and Judaism are much more similar than Christianity and Judaism. And again, this all comes from a lecture that he gave about Sephardic Jews. So there's a big difference, he says, between orthopraxy and orthodoxy. Judaism and Islam are behavior oriented with codes of law and practice, whereas Christianity is often based on grace. And there is a code of conduct, but it's not so legalistic, right? And so distinct traditions, ritual law, civic law, and criminal law, these are all different. You have, you know, that he's saying that Christianity is less about creed and specific articles of faith, which makes it harder for them to connect. But one of the main things is this Pact of Umar. It answers a series of questions posed by non-Muslims, and it set a legal standard. So basically, the Pact of Umar was somewhere around the 9th century, written by Muslims about Jews. And the main argument was that Jews were to be tolerated within Muslim lands, and Jews were known as people of the book. Their celebrations had to be rather quiet. Their houses of worship could not be taller than a mosque, and synagogues could not be rebuilt if they fell. They had to be, or I'm sorry, it could not be rebuilt if they fell. So, in other words, you had to build a new one in a new place. And so, non-Muslims also had to pay a poll tax. So there were certain things that the Jews had to do to live there, but it was actually a lot more free for them. They felt like they could at least tolerate these conditions. And so That sort of, in a nutshell, covers the basics of Islam. And I know there was a lot in there. I encourage you to go back and listen to it again. But we're going to go through another PowerPoint. This is my Monday lesson for my in-seat students. I have another one for the Wednesday lesson, which really covers more of your content for this particular Since 1500 course. But I just don't feel like you're set up very well to answer some of this without knowing the backstory. So there's your backstory. If you guys have questions, reach out. I'm happy to answer anything that you might have, and I look forward to seeing you in the next lesson.